So as Paul said, I'm going to start by presenting an overview of the big picture on the public finances side, and also talk a bit about the large tax changes that we saw yesterday and the changes to departmental expenditure limits that were allocated yesterday. The overall picture, if we compared the top line of borrowing from yesterday's numbers to what we saw in July, was that actually the forecast for borrowing wasn't very much changed over the next few years compared to what we expected before. But that was the net effect of many offsetting changes in the middle. In particular, as was well discussed yesterday, George Osborne benefited from a number of positive forecasting changes that in particular increased expectations for tax revenues over the next few years and reduced expectations of debt interest. Those positive news were slightly offset by some negative news, and the overall effect was to strengthen the public finances in the medium term by about £4 billion. George Osborne also announced a number of tax changes, which also gave him a bit more money to play with. In particular, there were two measures on the scorecard, which were the introduction of a new apprenticeship levy and the increase in stamp duty for second homes and buy-to-let properties. But there was also a third measure that wasn't counted on the scorecard, which is the ability for local authorities to increase their council tax by more to pay for social care spending. The effect of that policy is neutral for the public finances because the extra money will be spent on social care, but it does, as Paul mentioned in his opening remarks, shift the composition of the fiscal tightening away from spending cuts and more towards tax increases. So the first of the two major tax announcements yesterday was the confirmation and the details of the new apprenticeship levy. This is going to be a tax of 0.5% on wage bills in excess of £3 million, and that will come into place from April 2017. The policy that was announced yesterday was actually an improvement on what was mooted and what was consulted on over the summer. Previously, the government had been talking about simply exempting firms with fewer than a certain number of workers from this levy. That policy would have had the unattractive feature of creating a big cliff edge and a big disincentive from taking on the extra worker. So the policy they've actually gone with is much more attractive than what they were consulting on. But this levy will only affect about 2% of firms, so those with the very highest wage bills. And it's expected to raise £3 billion a year by 2019. The revenue from this tax will be hypothecated to pay for apprenticeship vouchers, and that money will be ring-fenced within departmental spending in England. The value of the voucher that employers will be entitled to will be linked to the levy payment that they make, but even those 98% of firms who pay no levy will be entitled to some apprenticeship vouchers. One feature of this hypothecation of the revenues directly to the apprenticeship vouchers is it means that the amount of money that will be available for this subsidy to apprenticeships will be directly linked to growth or falls in earnings over time. And I suppose one question is really whether that makes sense. Is it the case that the amount that we want to subsidise apprenticeships actually moves in the same way that earnings do over time? The apprenticeship levy is simply a tax on the employment and earnings of large firms, and the OBR expects in its forecast that the majority of that incidence will feed through into lower wages by the end of the forecast period, and that has somewhat depressed their GDP growth forecast by the end of the period. The vouchers themselves are likely to encourage apprenticeship training, in particular insofar as the voucher exceeds what firms would otherwise have spent on training for apprentices. It will encourage them to train more apprentices and to pay them more. However, there are some potential downsides of the policy. It may encourage firms to do too much training of apprentices. It may encourage them to do apprenticeship training at the expense of other types of training they might otherwise have done. And possibly it might just encourage them to engage in some relabelling activity, trying to get things classified as apprenticeships that were previously classed as something else. The second major tax policy was the introduction of a new 3% stamp duty, additional stamp duty rate for second homes and buy-to-let properties worth more than £40,000. And that will apply to purchases from April 2016 onwards. There will, however, be an exemption for large corporate landlords, and the government's going to consult on exactly what the definition of those will be. And that policy is expected to raise £800 million a year by 2019-20. The short-run effect of that policy, given that it doesn't come in until April 2016, is presumably that there will be a rush to buy second homes and buy-to-let properties between now and April. But thinking about the longer-term effect, at the margin, the policy is likely to raise owner-occupation rates in line with George Osborne's 5-point plan that he set out yesterday for encouraging owner-occupation in the UK, because it will make rental properties and second homes relatively more expensive and therefore discourage purchase of properties for that purpose. It may well also reduce house prices because of the increased costs for these subset of buyers, and it might also increase rents if it feeds through to the rents faced by people in buy-to-let properties. As I said, there is proposed to be an exemption for big corporate landlords, so there may well be a shift towards more big corporate landlords and fewer individual buy-to-let landlords. The Treasury says in their documentation that this is justified because of the role that these big corporate landlords play in investment in supporting the government's housing agenda. I guess there's a question really about exactly how they think those big corporates play that role in the market. It would be interesting to see a bit more detail on that evidence. There is clearly quite an implementational issue with this proposed policy in defining what exactly is a second home and a buy-to-let property. There are a number of ways that you might think you could get around this policy. In particular, what about the case where I buy a property, live in it for a little while, and then choose to let it out subsequently? But there are other ways that you might think that it would be hard to define this boundary. So those are the measures on the scorecard. There was also the change to council tax, which David will talk a little bit more about in his presentation on local government financing. On the spending side, there were also some measures affecting annually managed expenditure, in particular the changes to the proposed cuts to tax credits and some other welfare measures. There were some spending measures not on the scorecard. One of these is the increase in social care spending as a result of the higher council tax revenues. The other is a housing association policy. But the final thing that George Osborne chose to do yesterday with the good news on the forecasting changes and with the tax increases was to increase the amount of money that he was allocating to departmental spending over the next 4 years. Although, as you can see by the end of the Parliament in 2020, so the first year beyond the current spending review period, he hasn't really topped up those plans. In fact, there's a small net cut to those plans. So the top-up's really happening through this spending review period, smoothing the cuts that would in any case have been coming about. So where does that leave us then on the spending cuts over the next Parliament? As Paul said, there was a lot of talk yesterday about the end of austerity and easing the squeeze. It is worth reiterating that really, although he has topped up the spending plans, we're still in a situation where he's looking to make quite significant cuts to some areas of public service spending over the next few years. So things are perhaps not quite as bad as we thought they might be yesterday, but for many departments, it's far from an easy ride over the next few years. So I'm going to focus here on the cuts that were announced yesterday, or the allocation of spending that was announced yesterday for day-to-day spending by different government departments. I won't say too much in this presentation about capital spending, just for brevity. Before the announcements yesterday, looking at the figures that had been presented in the July budget, we estimated that the spending review was looking to allocate cuts of £16 billion to departmental spending, day-to-day departmental spending, and that equated to an average cut of 5% across all departments. But we already knew that George Osborne had committed to protecting over half of public service spending. And in particular, he committed to actually spending £8 billion more on those protected areas. So that's NHS and schools in England, overseas aid and defence. So that left us estimating that he was looking to make £21 billion worth of cuts out of the unprotected, non-devolved areas, equating to a 27% cut to those budgets on average. The change yesterday was that he topped up his overall spending plans by about £6 billion in 2019-20, reducing the cuts that he's looking for to £10 billion or 3% to overall day-to-day spending. There was essentially no change to the protections that he'd announced, and so all of that easing in the squeeze fed through into an easing in the squeeze on unprotected areas of spending. So what he was allocating yesterday was a cut of about £16 billion in real terms to day-to-day spending on the non-devolved unprotected areas, or 18% on average. But it was far from an even picture across the board. Some areas of departmental spending saw much larger cuts than others. You can probably guess from the x-axis on this chart what some of these numbers are going to be. And there really was a very big range. The departments seeing some of the largest cuts were Department for Transport, being cut by over a third over the next 4 years. Local government departmental expenditure limit being cut very significantly, although it's worth saying that that just reflects the grant from central government to local government. It's ignoring the other sources of local revenue, and David will come back to local spending power in more detail in his presentation. But right at the other end of the scale, the Cabinet Office seeing very significant real increases over the next 4 years, and in particular that reflects the extra money for the intelligence services. So that's what they're going to see over the next 4 years. We can add that picture to what we saw over the last 5 years to see how different departments have been faring over the 9-year period. And the broad picture is that the prioritisation of spending over the next 4 years looks very similar to what happened over the last 5 years. So the departments that did relatively badly last time have done relatively badly again this time. And there are a few exceptions to that rule. And that means that transport day-to-day spending is going to be cut by 70% in total compared to its 2010 level by 2019. But even above that, you see a number of departments facing cuts of between a third and a half, and that includes some of the larger departments such as Justice and the Home Office. The only real exception to the rule in the prioritisation is Defence, which saw a reasonably large cut last time, but this time is seeing an increase in its budget. So taking together yesterday's announcements with what we knew before about the plans for fiscal consolidation in the wake of the crisis, it's worth just taking a step back and seeing that where that leaves us in terms of the total fiscal consolidation plans. So what this graph shows is adding together all the measures that have been announced since early 2008 to deal with the fiscal problems of the crisis. What's the total plan? Well, the green bars here show what the total plan was from the July budget. The plan at that point was to achieve a total fiscal tightening of just over 10% of GDP, and to do that by 2019-20. Yesterday's announcements mean that we are aiming for pretty much the same position, so similar size of total tightening, but we're going to get there a little bit less quickly. So George Osborne is slowing the pace of consolidation over this Parliament. And the other thing he has done is to shift the balance between tax increases and spending cuts. So the July plan was that 14% of the consolidation would come from tax increases. Yesterday's figures suggest that now 17% will come from tax increases, but still heavily weighted towards the spending cuts. So George Osborne has 3 fiscal rules. I won't talk much about the first 2 of them, but the third of them that he introduced in the autumn of 2013 was his welfare cap. The welfare cap covers spending on what is known as welfare in scope. Essentially, this covers all of the vast majority of social security spending outside of the state pension. The Chancellor announces in advance a cash cap for spending on welfare in scope, and the OBR judges each autumn whether or not he has met or breached his cap. The cap is breached either if spending is forecast to rise above the cap simply as a result of policy change, or if it's forecast to rise above the cap by more than 2% as a result of a forecasting change. However, the original legislation is very clear that reclassifications of spending from welfare in scope to some other item of spending shouldn't either cause the Chancellor to breach his cap or allow him to meet it more easily. So the original legislation is very clear that if the Chancellor reclassifies any spending out of the welfare cap into some other area of spending, then the cap should be reduced commensurately. The 2014 budget was the first time that the Chancellor announced his cap, and therefore the autumn statement of 2014 was the first time that the OBR judged his compliance with it, and at that point they deemed him to be still within his cap. In the July budget, George Osborne announced a package of welfare cuts and chose to reduce his welfare cap to the new OBR forecast level of welfare spending over the next 5 years. So that was the cap that he was playing with when he made his announcements yesterday. It probably won't have escaped anyone's notice that George Osborne blew through his cap, certainly in the first 3 years. The reversal of the tax credit policies was enough to breach the cap, and George Osborne chose not to do any other policy action to try and offset that. And the OBR judges that he breached the cap in those 3 years yesterday. In the final 2 years of the forecast horizon, the OBR has officially deemed that the cap has been observed, but it's worth spending a minute or so just looking at that in a little bit more detail. So one thing that was not good news for George Osborne yesterday was that the forecast for many items of spending on welfare and scope went up yesterday. And in particular, that was the forecast for spending on disability benefits. There was quite a significant upwards revision to that. In 2020, that upwards revision to the forecast was sufficient in itself to breach the cap. In 2019-20, the forecasting revision wasn't quite sufficient to breach the cap, but the reversal of tax credit policies on top of that was sufficient in combination to breach the cap. The reason George Osborne was deemed not to have breached the cap was because of a shift that happened of an item of spending out of the welfare and scope and into the departmental spending of local government. And in particular, this was funding for temporary accommodation for people living in a local area. The Treasury has made the case that this reallocation of spending is likely to induce changes in behaviour amongst local government and in how they use and how much they spend on temporary accommodation in their area. As a result, they have argued that this classifies as a policy change rather than a pure reclassification. The OBR appear to have bought that argument, and therefore they have judged that the Chancellor has met his cap in those final 2 years rather than breaching it. It's an interesting case, and I think it raises the broader issue going forwards of the real difficulty in distinguishing between policy changes, forecasting changes, and reclassifications, and in really holding a Chancellor to account when these types of tweaks get made. So the overall picture from yesterday was that the fiscal forecasts improved, and the Chancellor chose to announce 3 new tax increases. That allowed him to ease up on the spending cuts planned, both in terms of the tax credit cuts and the planned cuts to unprotected spending areas. However, that still means that unprotected spending areas are facing a cut over the next few years. It's just a little bit less deep than was expected before yesterday's announcements. But there are some departments, in particular Transport and Justice, still facing quite significant cuts over the next few years and coming on top of large cuts already seen over the last 5 years. Looking at the overall fiscal consolidation, the Chancellor is aiming for the same size of consolidation by 2020 as he was in July, but the pace is going to be a little less quick, and the composition is going to be more reliant on tax increases than it was before. The Chancellor also yesterday chose to breach the third of his fiscal rules, although he's still complying with the first 2 of them.